Have you ever witnessed a colossal wolf stand toe-to-toe with a fearless frontier traveler, only to realize that the wolf was actually saving her life? In this story, Harriet Dawson faces that exact heart-stopping moment when a legendary alpha known as Phantom appears, not to hunt, but to warn her of an oncoming avalanche. The sight of this towering wolf, glowing eyes fixed on Harriet, is equal parts terror and wonder. And that's just the beginning. Welcome, friends and adventurers, to a tale that proves sometimes the wild itself can be your greatest ally. If you've ever doubted that nature has its own mysterious ways, this gripping saga will change your mind. Stick around to hear how Harriet teams up with a solitary mountain man, confronts treacherous interlopers, and follows Phantom's lead through a deadly storm. Trust us, you won't want to miss a single twist. Before diving in, please hit that subscribe button to support our channel. Your encouragement helps us bring you more exciting frontier stories like this one. Ready to find out the fate of Harriet's wagon, her new allies, and the wild wolves? Let's begin. Harriet Dawson stood at the threshold of her modest log cabin, a solitary figure against the vast, untamed reaches of Red Willow settlement. Dawn light illuminated the eastern sky in pale bands, while the jagged outline of the mountain range loomed like silent sentinels behind her. In the stillness of early morning, a distant howl reverberated off the pine ridges, raising the fine hairs on Harriet's neck. She paused, one hand braced on the doorframe, the other gripping the strap of her well-worn satchel. She knew the call of wolves too well after several years of frontier life. Most residents in Red Willow waved off such cries as routine background noise, but Harriet had come to respect these mountains and the predators roaming them with an intensity that bordered on reverence. She could distinguish a casual howl from a calculated hunting call, and in that moment, she sensed the latter. A cold sliver of dread nudged her heart as she listened to those wild echoes fade. Her precarious position as a lone widow out here had made her ever vigilant, and she eyed her horse-drawn wagon parked a few steps away. Sturdy wooden boards were piled high with pelts, dried herbs, and handcrafted goods she'd carefully prepared over months. These items were bound for Fort Ludlow, a 4-day trek through rough country that was about to be swallowed by winter's first major snowfall. Harriet had made such journeys before, always alone, carrying Red Willow's hopes on her capable shoulders. Many in the settlement mistrusted her independent ways, but they needed her proficiency at trading for essentials. And so they grudgingly accepted that Harriet Dawson did what she must, traveling dangerous trails without a man by her side. Before she could climb onto the wagon bench, a measured crunch of footsteps on frozen soil made her look up. Approaching through the dim light was Wayne Dobbins, the self-proclaimed head of Red Willow's makeshift council. Dressed in starched trousers and a heavy wool coat, he was tall and somewhat stiff in demeanor, always attempting to preserve Eastern propriety despite the rugged reality surrounding them. Removing his hat, he called out politely, "Morning, Miss Dawson. I came to see if you'd changed your mind about traveling today." Harriet exhaled, forcing a neutral expression. "I told you last evening, Mr. Dobbins, the trip can't wait. If we don't secure vital supplies before the snows come, we'll be in trouble. My wagon is loaded and ready, as you can see." Wayne cleared his throat. "We've heard talk of wolves moving closer to our outskirts. They tore up a traveler's campsite a week ago. Now folks are spooked. We think maybe you should take another settler along, Lane Scott, perhaps, or young Archie. No one would question your abilities, but an extra rifle is always wise." She nodded slowly, though the tension in her jaw belied her outward calm. An extra rifle means an extra mouth to feed. Besides, the settlement needs all the hands it can get for winter preparations. You know that as well as I do. He shifted, a hint of unease in his posture. "True enough. But folks worry about you. It's a 4-day journey to Fort Ludlow, and the storms brew faster each year. A woman traveling alone, and there's talk, it's reckless." Harriet offered a thin smile. "Or unseemly, more likely. I'm accustomed to such talk. But Wayne," she added more gently, "I appreciate the concern. Truly. Yet I've made this trip 3 times now without incident. Let me be on my way." Wayne looked at her a moment longer, then conceded with a nod. "Be careful, Miss Dawson. We'll keep the lantern burning for your return." She watched him depart, the echo of his heavy boots soon swallowed by the crisp air. Harriet murmured to herself, "I don't need luck. I need practicality. With a firm grip on her wagon's reins, she guided her two horses, Maisie and Flint, onto the narrow, winding path that branched away from Red Willow's cluster of cabins. The tall pines enclosed her on both sides, a vibrant kaleidoscope of green fading into cooler shadows. Her rifle, meticulously maintained, lay within easy reach on the wagon seat. She scanned the surroundings with the unblinking focus of someone who knew how swiftly danger could strike. Ahead lay miles of rugged wilderness, uncertain weather, and if the rumors held true, a wolf pack bolder than any she'd yet encountered. But Harriet Dawson's resolve was unshakable. She'd do what was necessary as always. The first day's travel was straightforward, though unease simmered in Harriet's mind. She stopped occasionally to check the horse's hooves for stones and to study the dirt tracks for any signs of wolf activity. Patches of ice and thin, new-fallen snow littered the higher ridges, and the distinct impression that she was not alone crept up on her more than once. The old Harriet from her pre-frontier life, a school teacher in a quiet coastal town, would have shuddered at such a thought. But the Harriet of today, forged by hardship and necessity, simply steeled her senses, silently daring any predator to show itself. When dusk approached, she guided Maisie and Flint into a snug clearing sheltered by looming boulders. She constructed a cautious ring of stones for her small fire, mindful that bright flames could attract curious or hungry animals. As she dined on dried venison and a half-stale biscuit, her thoughts roamed to Eamon, her late husband. He had been an army captain who believed wholeheartedly in forging new lives in the uncharted West. They had arrived in Red Willow with wide eyes and bold dreams, only to have a vicious fever claim him that first winter. Left alone in a land that prized strength above all, Harriet realized quickly that self-pity was a luxury she could not afford. Eamon had shown her how to load a rifle, how to skin a rabbit, and how to read subtle changes in weather, knowledge that saved her skin more than once. His memory, bittersweet though it was, stirred her heart each time she handled her rifle or glimpsed the wedding band she wore on a leather cord around her neck. A chill wind rattled the pines overhead, a herald of the storm Harriet suspected was not far behind. She meticulously checked her supplies, jars of smoked salmon and venison, small sacks of dried herbs, beeswax candles, and a carefully rolled piece of cloth containing numerous seeds she intended to trade for canning goods. The settlement might look upon her as a curiosity, but they needed her. If she did not barter for salt, coffee, ammunition, and other staples, Red Willow would feel the pinch come midwinter. Still, the memory of that howl, somewhere near daybreak, kept nudging her. Harriet had heard wolves before, sometimes at a distance that was merely atmospheric, a lonely backdrop to nights spent under star-flecked skies. But that morning's cry had rang with a predatory edge, a summoning that boded ill. She resolved to remain vigilant. Clutching her rifle across her knees, Harriet huddled close to the dying embers of her fire, her mind racing with plans, backup plans, and fallback strategies she'd honed since losing Eamon. A restless sleep eventually overtook her, punctuated by half-formed dreams of flickering shapes slinking between tall pines. At first light, Harriet quickly broke camp. The horses seemed uneasy, shifting and snorting in a manner that suggested they had caught a scent in the air. She stroked their necks, murmuring soft reassurances. Maisie and Flint were no pampered show horses. They were frontier survivors like her. But horses were prey animals at heart and never quite comfortable when wolves stalked nearby. Soon she was back on the trail, winding through foothills that angled upward into a rocky pass. Gray clouds thickened overhead, and the crisp tang in the wind all but confirmed that snow was imminent. Harriet spurred the horses on, hoping to make better time before visibility worsened. Each mile took her deeper into the labyrinth of narrow trails, scattered evergreens, and looming cliffs that characterized the approach to Fort Ludlow. As midday approached, a stark silence replaced the normal forest chatter. Birds had gone quiet, and even the scurrying of squirrels among branches died away. Harriet sensed something watchful lingering just out of sight. More than once, she halted the wagon to scan the tree line with the barrel of her rifle. Her nerves trembled with the certainty that something lurked, but she could not pinpoint it among the folds of the landscape. She pressed on, wary as a doe stepping across open ground. By the time the sun sat low in the sky on Harriet's second day, the air had grown frigid. Flurries of snow, delicate at first, began to swirl, pricking her cheeks and stinging her eyes. Determined not to lose her bearings, she mapped each bend in the trail in her mind, convinced that the route was correct. She had traveled this way before. It was the path Eamon and she had once taken together on a scouting trip. Yet the sense of being followed was more tangible than ever. Horses, much like frontier folk, often sensed trouble before it appeared, and Maisie's ears twitched almost constantly now. Then, on a sloped section of the trail, Harriet spotted them. Wolf tracks, faint but unmistakable in a muddy patch not yet frozen by the dropping temperature. Paws larger than any she'd encountered before. Alarm prickled up her spine. Could a pack be shadowing her? Wolves usually circumvented humans unless starving or emboldened by an alpha with unusual cunning. As the hours passed, Harriet glimpsed sporadic movement among the rocks above her, a fleeting blur of fur or flick of a tail. Once, she was almost certain she saw a large gray shape pacing alongside her, but at a safe distance. She lifted her rifle, scanning the ridges, only to find emptiness again. Snow began to accumulate in greater volume, forcing Harriet to slow the wagon lest the wheels slip on hidden ice. She eyed the cloud-shrouded peaks ahead, forecasting that she had barely enough light to make it to a small clearing by nightfall. Cautious of these increasingly brazen wolves, she resolved to push the horses on. The animals resisted but eventually trotted forward, breath steaming in the cold air. She finally emerged at the clearing, a place she recognized for its natural rock shelf she'd used in the past as a windbreak. But even before the wagon came to a halt, Harriet realized something was wrong. A colossal pine tree had toppled during a recent storm or avalanche, crashing down directly across her route. She slid off the wagon seat to investigate. The trunk was enormous, its branches contorted in a snarl of evergreen needles and broken boughs that effectively blocked the trail. Going around would mean a long detour through dense forest, an endeavor made even riskier by the descending night and the swirling snow. Her mind worked quickly, enumerating possibilities. She could attempt to unhook the horses and navigate carefully around the trunk, but that would cost her hours of precious daylight, and wolves had undoubtedly picked up her scent. The temperature was dropping faster now, each gust of wind slicing through her coat. Harriet stepped back to assess her next move, heart pounding. A shrill whine from Maisie made her whirl around in alarm. Her blood went cold at the sight. A massive wolf stood not 20 yards behind the wagon, eyes gleaming gold in the faint light. This was no ordinary wolf. Its shoulders were abnormally broad, its body tall enough to reach Harriet's waist. Something about its posture, a poised tension in the sinewy muscles, signaled an intelligence beyond mere instinct. Harriet had heard rumors in Red Willow of a colossal alpha known only as Phantom, a near-mythical beast said to outwit even the craftiest hunters. She had dismissed such stories as frontier folklore. Seeing this creature now, Harriet wondered if, in fact, the tales were understatements. The alpha wolf, Phantom, if the rumors were correct, emitted a low, rumbling growl. Harriet leveled her rifle, hands surprisingly steady given the jolt of adrenaline. Phantom made no move to charge. Instead, he turned his head slightly, as if listening. That's when Harriet heard the howls from behind her, echoing through the timber. The trap was set, the fallen tree to her front, the pack behind her, and this giant alpha all but corralled her wagon. Wolves rarely launched such coordinated ambushes unless they were starving or led by a singularly cunning alpha. Harriet realized she might be in mortal danger. Pressing her back against the wagon, Harriet scanned for an escape route. The boulders were too steep to climb, the overhead branches of the pines too high to scramble into. She had a half-dozen bullets, but a pack like this could easily circle, and she would run out of shots long before they ran out of teeth. The knowledge that she'd always managed alone did nothing to soothe the primal terror roiling in her gut. She steadied the rifle's barrel on the wagon seat, finger poised over the trigger. Phantom huffed, stepping forward as if to test her nerve. And then a new sound broke through, the snapping of branches followed by a figure bounding down the rocky slope. Out of the swirling snowfall emerged a tall man, draped in animal hides, his face partly hidden by an unkempt beard shot through with strands of gray. He carried a makeshift spear in one hand and moved with startling agility. Behind him stalked 3 enormous canines, each nearly wolfish in appearance, their fur bristling with energy, but their eyes locked onto their master's subtle hand motions. They were not quite domesticated dogs, nor wholly wild wolves, something in between, clearly under the man's command. Harriet froze, uncertain who posed the greater threat, Phantom and his pack, or the stranger who seemed almost as wild. Phantom pivoted his massive head toward the newcomer and made a noise Harriet had never heard from a wolf, a guttural half-snarl, half-greeting. The bearded stranger responded with a low rumbling sound of his own, and incredibly, Phantom stepped back, ears forward in cautious interest. Silence stretched across the clearing, thick with tension. Harriet remained glued to the wagon, rifle pointed toward Phantom. The alpha wolf, for his part, appeared caught between curiosity and suspicion, golden gaze flicking between Harriet and the newcomer. The stranger moved no closer to Harriet, instead shifting his attention to the giant wolf. His three wolf dogs, Cronin, Ember, and Wynn, flanked him with disciplined composure, not so much as a growl escaping their throats. At length, the bearded man spoke, his voice raspy from apparent disuse. "Lower your rifle," he said, without turning to look at Harriet. "They won't attack if we don't provoke them." Harriet didn't budge. "And who are you," she countered, "to speak so confidently about these wolves that have me surrounded?" He finally pivoted his head, meeting Harriet's stare with eyes the color of a winter sky, cold, piercing, and hauntingly calm. "Name's Gideon West," he replied. "I live in these mountains." "Phantom," he nodded at the wolf, "knows me." A tremor coursed through Harriet. Phantom, the name matched the legend. She found it surreal that the man would utter it so casually. "Harriet Dawson," she managed, her voice steady. "I'm from Red Willow, heading to Fort Ludlow, but I appear to have run into a bit of trouble." Phantom made another huffing sound, shifting his weight. Harriet's horses stomped nervously, their eyes rolling with fear. Gideon continued speaking, his words oddly measured. "There's a storm building, a bad one. Phantom and his pack have been moving down from the higher elevations for days, anticipating it. He's not hunting you, he's warning you off the path." Harriet could scarcely believe it. A wolf offering a warning? But she recalled how the howls had seemed more purposeful, how the giant alpha had not immediately attacked. "That's absurd," she whispered, more to herself than to Gideon. "Wolves don't herd people away from danger." Gideon's expression softened by a fraction. "They do if they share a common ground with someone who respects the mountains. Phantom is not just any wolf." He returned his attention to the alpha and made another of those quiet, growling sounds in his throat. Phantom listened, ears twitching, then whined softly. The tension in Harriet's limbs began to uncoil. "What do I do now?" she asked, though the question was aimed as much at Gideon as at herself. He gestured at the thickening snowfall. "Come with me. My shelter is about an hour's walk from here, if we move quickly. The road up ahead is exposed to avalanche in a storm this fierce. You won't survive the night out on that trail." A quick glance at the darkening sky confirmed Harriet's worst suspicions. The wind had turned sharper, and swirling snow half blinded her. She heard the distant boom of shifting ice in the high passes. To remain with her wagon could be suicidal, but the notion of trusting this ragged stranger and a giant wolf was unnerving. She locked eyes with Gideon. "I can't leave my horses to die." He nodded. "Bring them, but we have to move fast. My place is hidden and better fortified than here." To Harriet's astonishment, Phantom turned and bounded away as if leading an invisible escort. She watched him vanish among the dark pines, and a fraction of her fear lifted. Maybe the monstrous alpha was offering her an unexpected lifeline. Gideon whistled sharply to his three companions. Cronin, Ember, and Wynn responded instantly, forming a protective ring around Harriet and the horses, though they kept a safe distance to avoid spooking the animals. Harriet found it bizarrely reassuring to see these wolf dogs channeling their energy into guardianship rather than aggression. The fallen pine tree blocking the trail remained an obstacle. Gideon took one quick look at its massive trunk and waved Harriet back toward a barely visible branch in the path that curved upward along the rocky slope. He explained tersely that this detour was still treacherous, but marginally safer than waiting for an avalanche to bury them all. Harriet swallowed her anxiety, mustered her courage, and urged Maisie and Flint to follow. The horses tossed their heads but relented under her firm guidance. Her fingers felt nearly numb, a mixture of cold and adrenaline. She clenched her jaw, controlling her breathing. Each step required navigating hidden ice patches and slippery rock ledges. Gideon's wiry form ascended quickly, unimpeded by the loose scree or the surging winds. Now and then he paused to reach back and guide Harriet's steps. She noticed that he wore remarkably well-crafted furs and leathers, all weatherproofed, suggesting a deeper skill than that of a simple hermit. Every so often, Harriet glimpsed shapes far below, likely phantoms pack trailing them at a distance. The sight both comforted and rattled her. She had never known wolves to act like a protective retinue. Had Gideon somehow tamed them? That seemed impossible. Yet the synergy between man and wolf was undeniable. As they pressed on, Harriet told herself, survive first, ask questions later. By twilight, the wind was howling in earnest, and the storm verged on blizzard conditions. Harriet's eyelashes clung together with icy flakes, and each breath emerged like white vapor in the gloom. Gideon signaled a halt as they reached a steep bluff lined with ragged pines. He pointed to a crevice hidden by low-hanging boughs and drifting snow. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for Harriet to slip through sideways. This is it, Gideon said over the wind's roar. Hurry, bring the horses around that bend. There's a small hollow shielded from the wind. They'll fit. Harriet checked the area with practiced scrutiny. The hollow was indeed there, though it required some maneuvering to lead Maisie and Flint through the broken pines. Once the horses were as sheltered as she could manage, Harriet turned to see Gideon already disappearing into the crevice with wind. Cronin and Ember remained outside, scanning the night with watchful eyes, presumably to stand guard, or to help Harriet if anything went awry. A jab of concern stabbed her. What about the wagon? Gideon reemerged for a moment. We can't bring it. Storm's too fierce and we'd get trapped. If we're lucky, it won't be lost entirely. Once the weather breaks, we can try retrieving it. For now, it stays. Harriet's shoulders slumped. The wagon held vital trade goods and supplies as for Red Willow. It represented months of labor, but the fierce wind biting her exposed skin reminded her she had no choice. She gathered a few essential items, her rifle, some provisions, extra blankets, and squeezed into the narrow entrance after Gideon. The space opened up into a tunnel of sorts, nearly pitch black. Harriet stumbled, feeling her way with cautious fingertips along damp stone walls. Ahead, Gideon sparked a small torch, the sudden glow illuminating a winding corridor that stretched deeper into the mountainside. Within minutes, they emerged into a wider chamber where rock formations arched overhead like the columns of a natural cathedral. Harriet blinked, adjusting to the flickering light. A large fire pit rested in the center, ringed by stones and vented through a natural chimney high in the cavern's ceiling. Shelves, painstakingly carved into the walls, overflowed with hides, dried meats, and earthenware jars. In the far corner, Harriet spotted a sleeping area raised off the cold stone floor, topped with thick pelts. The place was surprisingly warm thanks to a steady draft of geothermal heat rising from cracks in the rock, and the air was less damp than Harriet would have expected from a cave. Gideon set his torch aside, then knelt to kindle a fire using tinder that had been kept meticulously dry. Harriet stood at the threshold, her breath slowing at the wonder of this hidden domain. You live here, she murmured. It's remarkable. He nodded, methodically placing small logs until the fire caught. Winters, yes. Summers, I move higher. This place has hot springs running beneath the rock. The smoke vents out properly. Good shelter from the storms. Harriet moved closer to the fire, drawn by its warmth. She gently placed her belongings on a makeshift bench. Wind patted over, nose twitching, then flopped beside the fire as though it was the most natural place for a wolf dog to be. Harriet's wariness lingered, but she was too exhausted to hold the tension any longer. Thank you, she said, voice subdued. If you hadn't come along, She broke off, picturing the looming figure of Phantom and the swirling snow. Gideon inclined his head. Storm kills faster than wolves most times. Phantom recognized the danger. He herded you away from the avalanche zones. I just happened to be near enough to help. Harriet gazed around the cavern. Old tapestries or rugs, likely bartered from traveling traders, hung in places, insulating the walls. There were intricately carved figurines set on shelves, bears, eagles, wolves. A small trickle of water ran through a narrow channel at the far edge, suggesting a fresh spring. The place was no crude hideout, but a well-tended residence that bridged nature's architecture and human ingenuity. Harriet's mind swirled with questions. How long have you been here? 15 years, Gideon replied. I came west after a war, wanted quiet, learned these mountains, found they taught me more than men's battles ever did. Wynne let out a soft chuff, and Gideon absently scratched the wolf dog's ears, an oddly tender gesture for someone so austere in manner. Harriet inched nearer, testing the boundaries of trust. "I've lived at Red Willow for 3 years," she volunteered. "Lost my husband, Eamon, to fever that first winter. Learned how to survive on my own. I guess I learned enough, until tonight." He nodded, neither offering pity nor prying further. "Your horses might hold out in that hollow. Cronin and Ember will check on them before dawn." The simplicity of the statement drew Harriet's attention. These wolf dogs possessed not only fierce loyalty, but also the intelligence to carry out tasks. "You're not surprised?" Gideon added. "Most folks, seeing a half-wild dog like Wynne, would recoil or try to shoot it." She gave a wry smile. "They're impressive, that's for sure. If you say they'll watch over the horse, I'll believe it. I was more shocked at how that giant wolf, Phantom, responded to you, as if he too saw you as a sort of pack." A ghost of a smile crossed Gideon's lips, making him look more human, less wild. "He and I share a history. It's not a matter of taming. More like an accord." Before Harriet could probe further, he shifted the topic. "You must be tired. There's a spare pallet near the far wall, fresh furs. Warm yourself. Storm's going to rage all night." Exhaustion flooded Harriet's limbs, but curiosity vied for space in her brain. She suppressed her questions for now, suspecting Gideon was not a man who revealed personal details lightly. Sliding off her boots, she wandered to the indicated pallet. The furs were thick and surprisingly clean, lacking the stale odor she usually associated with pelts. She lay down, hearing the crackle of the newborn fire. For a moment, the cave's flickering shadows lulled her. The last thing she saw was Gideon feeding a bit more wood to the flames, the back of his figure haloed by the fire's glow. Outside, the wind howled ferociously, but Harriet was, against all odds, safer than she had been on the open trail. Harriet woke intermittently through the night, drifting between fragments of dream. She pictured Eamon wandering a snowy forest, beckoning her to follow while phantom wolves threaded among the pines. Each time she stirred, the comforting pop of the fire and the warm furs pressed against her soothed her back to an uneasy slumber. Eventually, the howling winds diminished to a sibilant drone, muffled by the thick stone walls. Morning arrived in a pale hush. Harriet blinked in confusion at the rock ceiling overhead, momentarily disoriented. Then she remembered. Gideon West's hidden cave, the relentless storm, my mom, storm, the improbable alliance with a man who conversed with wolves. She sat up, pushing aside the furs. Gideon was already awake, setting a pot over the rekindled fire. The welcoming scent of pine needle tea greeted her nose. Wind stretched at Gideon's feet, and Cronin and Ember were nowhere to be seen, presumably out with the horses. "Morning," Harriet said, finding her voice. "Is the storm still raging?" Gideon tilted his head, listening. "Shifted overnight. Ice is forming, dangerous in a different way." He poured some steaming liquid into 2 wooden cups, handing one to Harriet. "Pine needle brew. Good for warmth and scurvy, so I'm told. I'm told." She accepted the cup, relishing the tangy steam. "I appreciate all this," she said softly, waving a hand toward her surroundings. "But I still can't quite comprehend what happened with Phantom." Gideon shrugged. "He's led that pack for many seasons. Some folks claim he's more spirit than flesh, considering how long he's survived. I've seen him defy traps, outrun armed hunters, and navigate storms that bury entire valleys. He's cunning, almost like he has a map of the land in his mind." Harriet sipped the tea, letting the warmth settle in her belly. Why would a wolf care if a lone traveler wandered into an avalanche zone? Usually they'd see me as potential prey. She paused, recalling Phantom's measured stare. It felt like he recognized me as something else. A flicker crossed Gideon's features. It's not the first time Phantom's acted to redirect travelers away from a deadly path, though it's rare. I suspect he senses who respects the wilderness versus those who seek only to conquer it. The mountains are his territory, but he's got no interest in wanton killing. Harriet nodded, mulling over Gideon's words. They made a strange sort of sense if one viewed the frontier not as empty land, but as a living tapestry in which creatures like Phantom played crucial roles. "What about those 3? She pointed toward Wynne, then gestured to where Cronin and Ember had left. They seem half wolf, half dog, entirely loyal to you. Gideon reached down to ruffle Wynn's thick fur. Wolf dogs, he confirmed. Born wild, but took to my company after I nursed them through injuries or fed them when prey was scarce. They'll always be partly feral, yet they choose to stay with me to learn the synergy of living on the margins. They scout, track, and guard better than any hound I've known. Outside, the cave entrance glowed faintly with dawn's light, but Harriet noted fresh layers of ice around the edges. She recalled the sound of avalanches the previous night, distant rumbles shaking the mountains. When do you think we can retrieve my wagon? Not soon, Gideon replied matter-of-factly. The path you are on is likely obliterated by drifts. More storms might be rolling in. The horses can't pull a wagon through deep snow and ice. Even if they could, you'd risk your life on those slopes, probably another couple of days at least. Disappointment weighed on Harriet. Red Willow would be worrying soon about her extended absence. But she was no fool. She'd braved enough winters to know that an icebound pass could be lethal. I suppose that's that, she said with a resigned sigh. At least I'm alive. Gideon's eyes flickered with an unreadable emotion. I better alive here than somewhere on the trail waiting to be found by spring thaw. Then he began to rummage through shelves carved into the cavern walls. In the meantime, we can make ourselves useful. You can help me check stores, see if anything needs airing out or repacking. The water table rose unexpectedly last month, soaked a few of my supplies. That was how Harriet came to spend her morning side by side with a man as silent as the stone around them, organizing and repackaging dried berries, salted fish, and bundles of herbs. She was struck by how meticulously Gideon maintained his resources. Every item had a designated place, every container sealed against moisture and pests. It was a system that mirrored Harriet's own precision in her cabin in Red Willow. At intervals, Cronin or Ember would return, shake off snow, and receive instructions from Gideon in low murmurs. Harriet couldn't decipher his words, though it sometimes seemed he was using subtle growls or whistles to direct them. She watched in fascination as the wolf dogs trotted back outside, apparently on another errand. She asked Gideon about his past, albeit delicately. He admitted he'd fought in a war during his youth, that he found society's noise and strife intolerable upon returning. Couldn't sleep behind walls of a town, he said simply. Found I slept better under the sky, or in these mountains that ask no questions, only fairness. Harriet thought of Eamon, the life she'd left behind, and how Red Willow's narrow expectations often chafed her soul. As the hours passed, Gideon's quiet stoicism became less off-putting. It felt instead like she was glimpsing the guarded edges of someone who understood that trust, in the wild, must be earned daily. By mid-afternoon, Harriet and Gideon were examining a dried herb supply when Wynn abruptly pricked his ears toward the entrance. Gideon fell silent, that alertness in his posture telling Harriet something, or someone, approached. She instinctively reached for the rifle set against the cavern wall. What is it? She asked in a hushed tone. Footsteps, Gideon answered, tilting his head as though listening to vibrations through the rock. He straightened. Human, at least two sets. They're near the cliff face. Could be travelers or... He didn't need to finish. Harriet understood that in these remote lands, strangers could mean danger, especially with the storm raging. Exchanging a quick glance, they snuffed the fire to reduce the glow and crept through the winding tunnel that led outside. Snow and ice still covered every surface, turning the entire mountain face into a brilliant but treacherous sheet. Wind padded in front, fur bristling but not barking, a testament to Gideon's training for silent approach. After a cautious climb, Harriet and Gideon peered over a rocky outcrop. Two men huddled against the base of a cliff, their small fire sputtering in the icy wind. One man had a crudely bandaged leg that was clearly bleeding through. The other paced fretfully, a pistol at his belt and constant curses on his lips. Their gear looked meager, ill-suited for the conditions, like novices in the frontier game. Harriet's breath caught when she spotted the tarnished brass buckle on a pack, standard Hudson Bay Company issue, often found with young or reckless trappers who arrived from the east, hoping to strike it rich. They'll freeze out here, Harriet whispered. We have to help. Gideon's gaze was cool. Maybe, but trust can be deadly. Let's get closer. I'll approach first. She nodded, slipping behind a boulder. At Gideon's signal, she would reveal herself. They needed to avoid startling these men and prompting a shot in panic. Gideon descended the slope deliberately, making enough noise to be heard, but not so much as to appear threatening. The pacing man jerked his head up, hand going for the pistol. Gideon halted, arms raised to show he carried no weapon. He'd left his spear behind for this reason. "Easy," he called. "I've got a shelter nearby if you need it." The injured man's face contorted in pain, and Harriet noticed how badly swollen his leg was. The other man, lean, with piercing eyes, kept his distance, suspicion plain on his features. "Who are you?" he spat. "Name's Gideon West," Gideon replied calmly. "I live in these mountains. Storm's lethal. I can guide you to a cave for the night." The pacing man cast a look at his injured companion. "This is Roland. I'm Lane. We, got trapped by the weather. His leg's caught in a snare, or was. We tried to free it, but the trap tore a chunk out." "That leg needs tending," Gideon observed, scanning the soiled bandage. "If infection sets, it'll cost him more than the winter." Lane's eyes narrowed. "What's your angle, old-timer? Why help strangers?" Gideon maintained a measured composure. "Mountains have a code. Offer shelter when a storm can kill. That's it. If you'd prefer to freeze, be my guest." He made a slight gesture with his hand, and Harriet took it as her cue. She emerged from behind the boulder, rifle lowered but ready. Lane's eyes widened at her appearance. A woman of all things, surprising him into momentary silence. Harriet raised her chin, projecting authority. "I'm Harriet Dawson from Red Willow. I can look at your friend's wound. But we need to move him someplace warm." Roland gave a ragged laugh laced with desperation. "Never thought I'd be so glad to see other humans." "Lane, put the pistol down." Lane hesitated, then slowly let his hand slip away from the gun. "All right then, but if this is some trick—" His voice trailed off threateningly. Gideon nodded at Harriet. They both advanced. Roland's leg was in worse shape than expected, the flesh around the trap wound already showing signs of infection. Harriet clenched her jaw, remembering the medical knowledge Eamon had taught her. She knelt, rifling through her small bag of herbs and cloth. "We should get him to better shelter before nightfall. This wind's only going to pick up." Gideon indicated a direction that was not his primary dwelling, but another less hidden cave he knew about. Harriet gathered that he did not want these strangers learning the exact location of his well-stocked hideaway. Lane, too, seemed suspicious, glancing up at the cliffs warily. For now, a blend of desperation and Harriet's presence seemed to keep him cooperative. With combined effort, they half-walked, half-carried Roland around treacherous ice patches and along a narrow goat track. Wind scouted ahead, occasionally pausing to glance back, ears pricked. Roland groaned with each jolt, and Harriet suspected the infection was already setting in. Lane was jittery, muttering curses whenever the slope threatened to drop them into a snow-choked ravine. Finally, they reached a broad cave mouth near an underground spring, a spot Harriet recognized by the telltale trickle of water and the patch of grass that stayed green longer than elsewhere. It was hardly luxurious, but the cave was large enough for the horses if Harriet could bring them here. Even so, Harriet sensed Gideon's reluctance. She caught his subtle glance, a silent promise that they would not share the location of his main dwelling. Once inside, Harriet set about building a fire, while Gideon darted out briefly to retrieve stored firewood he'd once stashed for emergencies. Lane hovered protectively by Roland, snapping orders Harriet mostly ignored, focusing instead on cleaning the wound. It was indeed a nasty cut, torn flesh and bruised bone. "You said it was a snare?" she asked quietly, dabbing a pungent blend of antiseptic herbs around the torn skin. Roland winced. "Yeah, we were setting lines for beaver and rabbit. Storm came faster than expected, and I misremembered where I'd placed one trap. Stepped right in. Damn fool move." Lane paced, restless. "We need to get out once Roland can move. I got line traps further up the pass. If we don't check them, that's a wasted investment." Harriet's eyes flickered with disapproval. Men new to the frontier often endangered themselves chasing quick fortunes. "You'll both be wasted if you try traveling again too soon," she stated. "Stay put until the weather shifts." Lane scowled but said nothing, evidently realizing they were in no condition to argue. Harriet's mind buzzed with suspicion. Something about these two, about the half-truths in their story, didn't sit right. For now, though, Roland's leg took priority. She hoped the herbal salve would stave off infection. Meanwhile, Gideon returned, stoking the fire into a respectable blaze. Wind took up a station near the cave entrance, muzzle resting on her paws but eyes sharp. Lane warily eyed the wolf dog as though it might lunge at him. "It's not a normal dog," Lane muttered, cocking his head. "What is that thing?" Gideon's reply was terse. "She's my companion. Best not to provoke her." That was that. Night fell quickly, and though the storm's fury seemed to have shifted to an intermittent drizzle of ice and snow, the cold seeped into everyone's bones. Harriet insisted Roland lie down on some rolled blankets she carried. Lane grudgingly thanked her, unable to hide his mounting fear for his friend's condition. They huddled around the fire, forging a fragile peace. Sometime well past midnight, Harriet stirred from a fitful doze near the fire. She sensed movement. Lane had risen, moving toward the cave entrance with purposeful steps. The flicker of flames danced across his tense profile, highlighting suspicious lines in his posture. Harriet's body tensed as she quietly shifted to grab her rifle. Gideon, she noticed, was also awake, eyes dark and unreadable, as he watched Lane. Outside the cave, ice-laden branches scraped in the breeze. Then a shape emerged at the threshold, Phantom, the giant silver wolf. He stood half in shadow, golden eyes shining with an eerie glow. In the dim light, Harriet could see a faint dusting of snow on his back, like stars sprinkled across a midnight pelt. He made no sound, simply watching. Lane gave a startled yelp, snatching for his pistol. "Wolf!" he cried, pivoting with fear in his eyes. "Stop!" Harriet and Gideon shouted in unison. But Lane's panic overrode any sense. He fired. The crack of the pistol in the enclosed space reverberated painfully. Phantom flinched, leaping to the side with astonishing speed. The bullet skittered off the stone, sparks lighting the darkness. In a heartbeat, Phantom vanished into the storm, but the tang of gunpowder and fear lingered. Gideon sprang forward, ripping the pistol from Lane's hands before he could get off another shot. Lane spun, outraged, but Gideon simply shoved him hard against the rock wall. "Idiot!" he hissed, fury simmering in each syllable. "That wolf was not attacking. You might have drawn the entire pack here with your stupidity." Lane's chest heaved as he glared back. "You want me to let a wild beast roam into the cave? Are you insane?" Harriet surged upright, fists clenched around her rifle. "That beast just saved my life yesterday and led me away from an avalanche zone. And you nearly shot him." She glanced at Roland, who was half sitting, face pale. "If Gideon and I hadn't been here, your friend would be lying in the snow, waiting to die." Lane's anger warred with confusion, then defensiveness. "You don't know wolves like I do. They smell weakness. That one was sizing us up, plain and simple." He spat on the cave floor, trembling with adrenaline. In the corner, Roland coughed. "Lane, calm down. They said that wolf is different. You don't have to shoot everything that moves in these mountains." Gideon relinquished his grip, but pocketed Lane's pistol. "You'll get this back when you show some sense. I won't have you firing off shots at every shadow." Harriet checked the cave entrance, half hoping Phantom might reappear. Nothing but silent darkness. She fretted that the bullet might have grazed him. She turned to Gideon, her voice low. "We need to see if he's hurt." Lane sneered. "You're going out there in the dark to find that monster? Suit yourself." Gideon nodded to Harriet, ignoring Lane's remark. "I'll go. I can track him." "I'm going with you," Harriet declared. "If he's bleeding, it's partly because of our involvement in bringing these fools here." Roland opened his mouth to protest, but Harriet's glare forestalled him. Gideon doused the fire to embers, signaling a retreat from the cave. Wynne stayed behind to watch Lane and Roland, though Harriet suspected the two men weren't about to leave the meager warmth now that they'd realized how brutal the outside truly was. They slipped into the night, the wind having reduced to a bitter hiss. Fresh snow crunched underfoot, and occasional gusts rattled ice-laden branches overhead. The moon, veiled behind clouds, offered scant illumination. Gideon moved with practiced stealth, Harriet close behind, her heart hammered, her mind swirling with concern for Phantom, and for what Lane's reckless aggression might signify. After a careful search along the perimeter of the cave's approach, Gideon knelt, examining footprints in the slush. "He was here," he murmured. "Blood, a few drops." Harriet exhaled shakily. So Phantom was wounded. Gideon rose, beckoning Harriet to follow. They tread across a narrow ledge where the footprints grew faint. Gideon seemed to navigate by feel and intuition, scanning rock outcroppings and occasional wolf prints that melted in the ice. At last, in a small copse of battered pines, Harriet glimpsed movement. The silver shape of Phantom lay half-concealed beneath drooping branches. Gideon advanced slowly, hands open and posture unthreatening. Phantom's ears pricked. Even wounded, the wolf exuded a regal power. He bared his teeth in a warning, then relaxed upon recognizing Gideon. Harriet saw a dark streak staining Phantom's left flank. The bullet, if it hit, may have just grazed him, but a graze could still fester if not treated. She hesitated. Could they even treat a wild wolf's wound? Gideon made soft growls, the same language he used with Wynne. Phantom rumbled in response, but he allowed Gideon to approach. Harriet hovered, rifle slung over her shoulder, her breath clouding in the icy air. She saw Gideon run a hand lightly over the blood-matted fur. A graze, yes, he whispered. We can clean it. Might help if you approach slowly. Let him smell you. Harriet inched forward, each step slow and non-threatening. She recalled how Phantom had seemed to single her out for protection on the trail. It felt insane to treat a wounded wolf in a freezing forest at night, but her conscience demanded it. She pulled a strip of linen from her pouch, doused it with a mild antiseptic solution from a small flask. Phantom stiffened as she knelt beside him, but Gideon murmured softly. Harriet placed her free hand out for Phantom to sniff. The wolf's amber eyes watched her with a calm so intelligent it made her throat tighten. Phantom allowed Harriet to gently press the cloth to the wound. She dabbed away dried blood, trembling slightly when the wolf huffed, yet he didn't snap. Gideon continued soothing him with quiet, guttural sounds. When Harriet finished, she nodded at Gideon, and they both eased back. Phantom tested his weight, flicking his ears as though to confirm the job was done. Then, in a swift motion, he disappeared into the darkness, leaving only paw prints and Harriet's pounding heartbeat behind. Gideon set a steadying hand on her shoulder. He'll heal, he said. He knows these mountains like no other. A new tension replaced Harriet's initial relief. Lane's rash action had altered the fragile balance. Phantom would be wary, and Harriet worried about what that might mean for Gideon's relationship with the wolf pack, and for her own wagon, still lost amid the snowdrifts. They trudged up slope, guided by Gideon's uncanny sense of direction. Harriet's thoughts churned. She recalled how Phantom had escorted her away from avalanche danger. That memory still felt surreal, but no less real. She gritted her teeth, determined not to let Lane's bullet spoil the tenuous link she shared with Phantom. Eventually, Gideon paused near a half-buried pine trunk. We're close to where we left your wagon, he announced. The roiling clouds parted momentarily, allowing enough moonlight to illuminate a twisted trunk that Harriet recognized. This was the very spot she'd been cornered when Gideon first appeared. The massive pine that had blocked her path still lay in a tangle, but something looked different. Didn't you say this path was impassable? Harriet asked, stepping over to the trunk. She saw that part of it had shifted. Perhaps an avalanche on the upper slope had dislodged debris, clearing a narrow space wide enough to maneuver. It might, given fair conditions, allow her wagon to pass. Mountain slides have changed the terrain, Gideon observed. He crouched, brushing aside loose snow to reveal the wagon's wheel tracks, half frozen. They followed them, creeping around the uprooted pine until Harriet's wagon came into sight. Relief flared, but it was short-lived. The wagon lay partially overturned, a thick layer of ice encasing its undercarriage. A half-torn tarp fluttered in the breeze. No, Harriet whispered. She scrambled forward, slipping and sliding until she reached the wagon. Her precious goods, furs, seeds, handcrafted items for trade, were scattered. She saw footprints crisscrossing the area, some deeper in the melted snow. Someone was here before the freeze, she noted, pointing at the prints. They rifled through my cargo. Gideon scowled, lifting a small leather bag near the wagon. Lane's pack? It has that same brass buckle. He opened it, revealing an assortment of Harriet's items. Carved bone buttons, a packet of expensive tea, a silver pendant Harriet had planned to trade. Looks like our helpless troopers looted your goods. A mixture of rage and betrayal roiled inside Harriet. She recalled how Lane had demanded to know Gideon's angle for offering help, yet the real manipulator was Lane himself. They must have stumbled upon the wagon earlier, she surmised, her voice trembling with anger. Roland's injury might be real, but they didn't accidentally lose their way. They were prowling for easy loot. The swirling wind cut across them, carrying a faint whisper from the high peaks. Harriet hefted a piece of cloth with her name embroidered, an item she'd planned to give a friend back in Red Willow. "Those thieves," she muttered, fists clenched. "They're not just incompetent novices. They're opportunists, stealing from me while I was fighting for my life in the storm." Gideon Rose faced grim. Lane and Roland planned to feign innocence until they got what they needed. Then they'd vanish, possibly try to track us back to my cave or your settlement to pillage more. He threw the stolen items back into Harriet's wagon. Phantom must have known, or at least sensed they were trouble. That's why he guided you away from the pass, and now led us here to show us the truth. Harriet's anger mingled with admiration for the wolf. "We have to confront them, but carefully. They're armed, though you took Lane's pistol. Armed or not, desperation can be dangerous. They're going to want to leave soon or figure out how to dominate the situation. They may guess we discovered the theft if you suddenly vanish with me, or if we come back glaring." Harriet tested the wagon's position. "Too icy to haul this back just now, though the path is partly clear. Another day or two we can try. The goods that remain are soaked or frozen, but some can be salvaged." She rose, brushing snow from her gloves. "Let's return to the second cave and handle Lane and Roland. I won't let them slip away unpunished. Not with my things, and not with potential to harm you, me, or Phantom." Gideon scanned the dark horizon. "Agreed, but it may be best to relocate to my main dwelling eventually, in case they bring trouble. My place is more defensible, with multiple exits. That lower cave is wide open." Harriet nodded, remembering how Phantom had blocked her path earlier, steering her back to Gideon's primary shelter. "So Phantom was right to keep us away. He sees the bigger pattern." She let out a breath that crystallized in the cold. "I owe him a debt." They left the wagon, carefully covering evidence of their discovery. Harriet tucked the stolen items back into Lane's bag, intent on using them as leverage. The trek back was punishing, the wind picking up once more. Yet Harriet felt a renewed sense of resolve. She was no stranger to confronting adversity. The question was how to do it without bloodshed. Lane was unhinged enough to shoot a wolf unprovoked, and Roland, while physically compromised, might be cunning. As they approached Gideon's cave, Harriet steeled herself for the confrontation that lay ahead. She suspected Lane and Roland had awakened more trouble than they bargained for. Storm or not, Harriet Dawson was not one to let thieves profit from her misfortune. She cast a final glance at the swirling night, half hoping to catch a glimpse of Phantom's silver coat. There was only darkness, but the ghostly memory of that regal wolf buoyed her spirits. The frontier was harsh, but Harriet felt an odd camaraderie with the Watchers of the Wild. Now that she knew the truth of Lane's betrayal, she would not rest until justice was served, and an even deeper question stirred in her heart: whether she would ever return to Red Willow, the same woman who'd left. Dawn's pale glow revealed a sky laden with fresh storm clouds, threatening another wave of snow. Harriet and Gideon reached his main cave, where Cronin and Ember greeted them anxiously. Phantom was nowhere to be seen, but Harriet sensed he was out there, observing or scouting in silence. The fire inside Gideon's dwelling was little more than embers. Harriet shivered and set about restoring the flames while Gideon unfastened his furs, stepping into the calmer air of the cavern. Harriet pondered her next move. "We need a plan," she said. "We can't just stride into the cave with Lane and Roland brandishing evidence. They'll lash out or run off." While Gideon stoked the embers until flames rose. "We have an advantage. They don't know about this cave. You can't retrieve your wagon right away, so maybe we draw them out. Secure your supplies, or what's left, in a safer location. Then confront them." She exhaled, sinking onto a makeshift seat near the fire. This entire journey was supposed to be about trading for Red Willow's winter needs. Yet here I am, entangled in a conflict with a pair of thieves. Her voice carried a note of irony. "Maybe I should have listened to Wayne Dobbins after all." Gideon offered a rare, faint smile. "And leave the settlement starved for coffee and salt? Seems out of character." He began checking his bow and arrows, presumably for any conflict that might ensue. Harriet noticed the skill evident in every arrow's fletching, handmade with precision. "I've tried so long to balance independence with the settlement's demands," Harriet said softly, the reflection of the flames dancing in her eyes. "Red Willow never fully accepted me. They tolerate my abilities but can't quite accept a woman surviving on her own terms. Lately, I've been wondering if there's another path. Gideon peered up, curiosity in his gaze. Another path? She nodded, heart pounding with unspoken convictions. Being out here these past days, seeing how you live, how Phantom and the wolves roam, it's opened my eyes. Maybe I don't want to return to that narrow life after all. I could build a small outpost near the mountains where I can trade with Fort Ludlow on my own terms, where the settlement's rules and gossip can't hem me in. A contemplative silence filled the cave, broken only by the crackle of burning pine. Cronin padded closer to Harriet, sniffing at her boots. She scratched the wolf dog's ears absently. "People will call me mad," she said, "but maybe I am. At least out here, I know who I am." Gideon finally spoke. "The mountains demand respect. If you build a post, you'll be bridging two worlds. But bridging can be dangerous. I had to learn that the hard way, dealing with trappers, hunters, outlaws." He gestured to the shelves of supplies, the carefully tanned hides, the cunningly vented chimney. "This took me years. I had to fight for it sometimes." Harriet's gaze swept the cave, its carved shelves and smooth floors, each detail a testament to Gideon's dedication. "I understand," she said. "I'm not claiming it'll be easy, but I'm tired of living in half measures. Maybe it's time I commit to my own vision." A faint swirl of wind whispered through a hidden passage, stirring the fire's flames. Harriet closed her eyes a moment, inhaling the earthy scent of the cavern. She could almost sense Amon's memory nodding approval. The man who had believed in forging new paths would not have wanted her to wither under the settlement's scrutiny. Gideon nodded as though making a decision himself. "First, let's handle these trappers. Then, if you still wish to carve out your own place on the edge of civilization, I'll help. Could be we both stand watch between worlds. Phantom might even appreciate having more humans who honor the land's rhythms." Harriet's lips curved in a rare, genuine smile. "Thank you." They spent the next hour refining their plan. Gideon would take Cronin and Ember to surveil the lower cave from a vantage point, ensuring Lane and Roland didn't slip away. Harriet would approach under the pretense of checking Roland's wound. Once inside, she'd present the stolen goods as proof of their betrayal. If Lane resisted or threatened violence, Gideon and the wolf dogs would intervene. Harriet half expected the men to beg for mercy when confronted or to become rash. Either way, she intended to leave no doubt about the consequences of theft on the frontier. With final preparations made, Harriet rose to gather her gear. As she did, a flicker of movement drew her eye to the cave entrance. A long shadow, then a flash of silver. Phantom. He did not enter, but for a moment, Harriet saw the outline of his head, ears alert, golden gaze meeting hers across a gulf of stone and swirling snow. In that silent exchange, Harriet felt a surge of gratitude and resolve. Whatever came next, she would not forget the wolf that had intervened when no one else could. Phantom blinked, then melted back into the whitening storm. A hush lingered in the cave. Harriet and Gideon exchanged glances. They both understood that while the settlement in Fort Ludlow might regard the great silver wolf as a legend or a menace, Harriet had witnessed a deeper truth. The wilderness had its own protectors, its own guardians that commanded respect. Phantom was one such guardian, capable of forging uneasy alliances if approached with humility. He had, in a sense, orchestrated Harriet's survival, and perhaps her awakening to a bigger destiny than she had ever imagined. At last, Harriet shouldered her rifle and nodded at Gideon. Together, they ventured back into the stark winter sunlight, prepared to settle matters with Lane and Roland. Beyond that confrontation lay Harriet's future, a new path blending the wild's freedoms with the practicalities of trade. She envisioned a small homestead at the mountain's base, a place for goods to flow between Red Willow, Fort Ludlow, and the scattered trappers. Would it succeed? Yeah. She could not be certain, but Harriet believed that if a wild wolf could extend a paw of protection, if a silent mountain man could open a hidden cave to a stranger, then there was room in this harsh frontier for unexpected alliances, and for one determined woman to carve out her own fate. As they set off down the icy trail, Cronin and Ember trotting at Gideon's heels, Harriet felt a keen sense of resolve and even a spark of exhilaration. She had come out here for practical reasons, supplies and trade. Instead, she had discovered a calling. The wolves that once haunted her dreams now served as guides, revealing not just hidden roads through the mountains, but hidden truths within herself. Perhaps that was always the mountain's lesson. Only by facing nature's raw challenges and trusting in its strange mercies could one find the courage to transcend the limitations others placed upon them. Enduring the cutting air and the uncertain ground, Harriet Dawson had never felt more alive. Winter might rage with unbridled power, storms might bury trails, and men might scheme for advantage. But she walked forward with new purpose. In her mind, she saw a future shaped by a partnership with these wild creatures, an outpost bridging the edges of civilization. She might hail from Red Willow in name, but the mountains had chosen her in spirit, and she intended to answer that call, no matter how rough the journey ahead. From a lonely wagon ride under threatening skies, Harriet Dawson's journey evolved into an extraordinary alliance with both man and wolf. Through each harrowing twist, the toppled tree, betrayal by desperate trappers, and a legendary alpha wolf stepping in to guide rather than harm, she discovered resilience she never knew she possessed. In the end, she and Gideon formed a bridge between the settlement and the wild, showing that respect and empathy can flourish in even the roughest conditions. Above all, this story teaches us that a heart open to the unexpected can find friendship and support in the unlikeliest places. Harriet's new vision, an outpost that honors frontier demands while preserving the wilderness, paints a hopeful future for all. What do you think? Please share your thoughts and ideas in the comments below. We'd love to discuss the story with you. Remember to subscribe for more gripping tales and to join our growing community of frontier enthusiasts.